what we're going to be talking about today is adding particles to VRoids. And technically any VRM, but I feel like VRoids are just sort of this common touch point that many people jumping into VTubing is familiar with. We're going to go all the way from starting it up, exporting from VRoid Studio, all the way through editing it in Unity and getting it into some kind of application to run it. The whole process. Now, that tutorial exists elsewhere on YouTube. There are several tutorials that do that. So where we're going to be breaking new ground here is that most of the time spent in this tutorial is not going to be about that process, but rather how you make particle effects. How do you make a particle system not look like ass? And you know, what can you do with it? How do you use the subcomponents in a system to make things happen? Because that's what I struggled with finding tutorials for when I have been working on this model. Because once you start looking in that space, you get yourself a lot of game development. You get the occasional like VR chat world, stuff like that, that doesn't quite fly. There's a lot of extra information that you don't necessarily need, and there is missing bits that you don't realize are going to be pitfalls because making it work on a model is a little bit different. One notable issue, of course, is that in a model, your particle system has to function on a transparent background, a thing that doesn't exist in games or VR chat worlds. You never see through the game to your desktop behind. There's no transparent backgrounds that ultimately has to be dealt with by particles. But when you're using your model, your background is transparent, and so your particles need to continue to be visible on that transparent background. So like that's sort of one of those examples of things that you'll never realize is something you have to tackle until you start sort of poking around at this sort of thing. And the tutorials just aren't out there talking about how you make particle systems for a model specifically. So that's kind of the broad strokes of what we're going to be tackling today. Till then, how do we do the thing? So first and foremost, we've got essentially four steps in the process. We need to get our VRM out of VRoid, or wherever we're getting VRMs from. Doesn't have to be VRoid, but that's sort of the obvious one, and that's what we're going to use for the demonstration. We get it out of VRoid. We're going to then need to set up our dev environment with, you know, Unity, the various plugins we're going to need. We'll go over that. Then we need to do the thing, right? Go into Unity, make the magic happen, and then we need to get our model out of Unity in the correct format so that it can be used. That's the step. 4 steps. Very easy. Probably. So, first and foremost, I have VRoid here. Kappa's very old original VRM. So, first and foremost, I'm just going to pull out one of these sample models. Just, you know, a whatever model. Just going to open it up, export it, pull it out, and then we're just going to use that. So we open it up. We've done whatever editing is necessary to make, you know, your base VRM. You can get your assets from Booth. You can, you know, do the general VRoid Studio stuff that many more people are much better at than I am. I'm not that good at VRoid. I pull it out, throw it into Unity, and I do all my work there. But we've got our VRoid Studio. We go up here to export as VRM. We get that exporting. So in general, when you're going to be using the VRM in Unity and making edits to it, you want to essentially eliminate any of the reductions they could potentially do, just because it will limit you in the long run. You don't want to find yourself wanting to accomplish something and realizing because you did this optimization at the beginning, you're suddenly unable to do it. That's gonna really suck. So when you plan to use a VRM in Unity, do what I just did. You don't want to let it delete transparent meshes. You don't want to adjust any reductions up. You want to make sure that you're not combining your hair mesh. Keep it all independent. And then from there, you export it. I'm going to use VRM 0.0. I'm not fully sure on VRM 1.0's support still, because I think some applications don't work with it properly. I'm not sure on all of its usages. So I've never had any problems with the VRM 0.0, and spoiler alert, at the end of this, it's not going to be our VRM, so it doesn't really matter. I know that VRM 0.0 works. I could be behind the times on that. I haven't exported in quite a while because I've just had my model in Unity for so long. So we're just going to use 0.0 today, though. We don't really care about literally any of this stuff. We're just going to export the bad boy. We will throw this onto the desktop, and here we have our demo VRM. Okay, so that's step one, already done. Look at that. We're 25% of the way done, in a certain sense. Okay, so from here, we're going to have to set up our environment. We're going to have to get all of the pieces necessary to go forward with, the editing. So the main thing you need is obviously Unity. Now, this becomes a little bit more complicated than it would be ideal, because we have to keep track of what version of Unity we're working with, because this is important. So the old standard, I would say, for working with models with particles, I guess, and displaying it in the end is VSeeFace. VSeeFace is what I used to use. It was very effective, but it was running specifically. Hold on, let me run up this guy. It was so for VSeeFace, you need to use version 2019 for 31F1. And you can do that. That's fine. There's no problem with that. You'll need to use VSeeFace when you're done. Now, I choose to use Vnyan. I think it's just better. It's more feature-rich. There's nothing wrong with the VSeeFace, but Vnyan just brings a lot more to the table. If you're working with Vnyan, you need to be working with editor version 2020.340F1. Those are sort of the necessary versions. I have links to the Unity hub down below. I am going to be using 2020.340 because I will be using Vnyan in the end. Of note, if you edit in 2020 and export your model, it will not work in VSeeFace. If you edit in 2019 and you export, it will work in VSeeFace, and it will also work in Vnyan. However, some of the particle system values will not behave as they appeared to in 2019. Some of the physics engine got modified between 2019 and 2020 that causes sort of speeds and sizes and sort of physics interactions to change. And so the outcomes will not be the same as what you expected. So that's kind of where you're at. 2019 technically works for both Vnyan and VSeeFace. 2020 only works for Vnyan. So keep that in mind. Okay, so once we then have our Unity, the next thing we need to worry about is plugins. We need 2 plugins to make this happen. We need one that anybody that's sort of been working with their VRMs in Unity before is going to be familiar with, which is UniVRM. So UniVRM is the application, or the plugin, I should say, that is used to import a VRM into Unity so that it functions properly. I have the link for UniVRM down below as well in the description. It's a GitHub link, and so that's there. Then the second one you're going to need is VSF SDK. So VSF SDK is what's going to allow us to export the model in the format we will need, which is a VSF avatar. So that is going to add the additional features necessary to make particle systems work in the model, whereas in a VRM, not going to do it. If you try to export, you add all these particle systems, try to export as a VRM, not going to work. They're just not going to do anything for you. So we'll need that VSF SDK. Also, link below. Now, we do need to consider versioning for UniVRM. Now, VSF SDK, you're going to just want the newest version. VSF SDK, however, has not been tremendously updated in some time, and so it has a suggested version of UniVRM, which is fairly old. That is the version that I use, which appears to be UniVRM 0.89. I do not know how they interact if you're using a newer version of UniVRM. It may be possible that it works. I expect actually that it's probably necessary to have a newer UniVRM if you're trying to import a VRM 1.0. I'm just not totally sure on how those will interact. So I default to trying to use exactly what is suggested. So this is the page for VSF SDK. You can see here where it's telling you the Unity you need, which is only true if you're using VSeeFace afterwards. Vnyan is an exception. And then over there, you can see the UniVRM suggestion of 0.89. So that's the page. That's where we're getting that information. And this is where you can download from the releases over here. You can download the plugins. Once you have those two plugins, so this is what they end up looking like. There, you can see their little Unity packages. You got those two. Now, I, of course, already have them in my Unity, but in order to add them to Unity, in Edit, there is... No, in Assets. My mistake. In Assets, there is an Import Package, Custom Package, and then you can, navigate to where you're going. Desktop, you just grab your packages, and it'll put them into Unity. You'll know that worked because it will add additional drop-downs. You can see here I've got VRM 0, that's UniVRM. And VSF SDK, that's, well, obviously the VSF SDK. Ta-da. Okay, so once you've got those pulled in, you've got your Unity installed, now we have the environment set up. Now we are good to go on development. So, let's go and make ourselves a new scene. We will name this our tutorial, particle tutorial. We'll open that up. Is that open? Yes, it is. Okay. So, we're now opened up. So, now we've got to pull in our VRM. So we go up to our VRM 0 drop down. We go to import. And I think you can also just drag and drop it in. I think it just does the trick. But we'll go through this process. Here's our demo.vrm. You can see it there. Just populates the list. We open. It will ask you where in assets to put it. Allow me to make a new folder. particle tutorial. We'll just double click in there, save that. You can see it's thinking, it's processing, it's doing the import. It takes time. I don't know why. It's not that big a file, but apparently it's complicated. So in this process, we'll end up with a prefab and all of the relevant folders under them. And all of those pieces are important. I am by no means an expert on VRMs. I have sort of, over time, learned many of the pitfalls, things to avoid, things that can go wrong, but there's still plenty that I'm struggling to sort of solve sometimes. So down here, this is our sort of asset viewer. I'm not sure what they call all these windows, but this is essentially our asset viewer. And you can see this is where we can sort of find all the stuff, but this is our prefab. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab our prefab, drag it into the scene here, and now it is part of the scene. We can double click on that and it will take us to it. So now we have our model. Now, I would generally encourage, I guess it doesn't matter. I guess I can go ahead and do that. So you can unpack prefabs, but that sort of, I think, runs into some issues with the way VRM operates because it relies on this prefab. And so I think it's usually best if you go into prefab and then open in isolation. So then you end up with this blue background. And now we can edit this. And every time we save, it will overwrite this prefab so that it stays up to date and consistent with reality, you could say. My model is an absolute mess because I unpacked it and it in no way resembles that prefab, and I don't necessarily know how to get it back in line and functional. So don't make that mistake that I made. Work on it in the prefab. Okay. Now, we are ready to start making a particle system. So there are a couple particle systems that, if I've got time, I want to explore and try to make. I have not made these beforehand. I just had thought one of them was what I was originally thinking and seemed like a good idea. And the second one, I had somebody specifically ask me how they could add a will-o-wisp to their model. They didn't specifically ask if it needed to be a particle system, but I said, hey, that sounds like it would be easiest as a particle system. So that's number two. The first one that I had in mind was, let's make a halo. It's very unlike anything that I've made for my model. Mostly, it's sort of an interesting use case. Lots of people like halos on their model, and so I think this is going to be a good example of like the versatility and the various ways that you can get something accomplished. So we're going to try to give this model a halo. So when we are working in Unity, this is over here. This is our sort of scene viewer, and it's the whole hierarchy of everything in the scene. Though right now it's just the prefab, and that's fine. We don't care about anything outside of the prefab. So outside of this, so if we were to add, say, literally anything, let me just add a box. 3D object, freaking cube. So you can notice that it actually forced it under the prefab because we're looking at the prefab. But you'll notice that it is within this. So if you're looking at the scene, anything that is not under this, that core base model name, will not be in the model at the end. So we work with what's under this. Now let me get rid of this dumb cube. But you can see in here, we've got our hairs, secondary. Secondary in VRMs control your spring bones. So like this is how you control the bounciness of hair or whatever you've used spring bones on. That's what goes into secondary. And then we have all of its pieces. And this is all of the default VRM naming. You can rename it. There's nothing wrong with renaming it, but there are some advantages to keeping it the same because it's sort of standardized. And if anybody is sort of putting out things that are supposed to work with VRMs, if you don't change these, it will still work with your model. Otherwise, you'll have to do the translation of, oh, well, if they're talking about, J, Aj, L, face, I renamed that to, left eye. So I've got to figure out what that is. But I digress. So this is structured in a hierarchical fashion. So when we are trying to tie a new object of any sort, particle or otherwise, to a moving piece. So if we want to put it, say, in our finger or on our head for the halo, we have to find the correct object that then we want to put it under so that it moves along with it. Because the way it's structured, you can see here, is there's hips, which is, a lot of your main lateral movement. So that's kind of the core movement point is your hips. And then the spine can also move as well, but it will move with the hips. And then, you can continue going down the chain. You've got the neck tied to the head. So obviously the head moves with the hips. The hips do not move with the head because they are, that's the order. So in this case, right, we want to tie a halo to the head so that when you move, the halo moves with it. So it's going to be directly under the head. You can see we've got all kinds of hair here to confuse us. But these are all of the things that move with the head. We've got 2 eyes and a bunch of hair. What we're going to do is we're going to create empty, this new object, which will be halo system. So now the halo system exists, technically. So now when we make objects like this in Unity, it's going to sort of default to the base location of the parent. So you can see this little widget here of the movement axes. This shows where it is, or where the center of the object is. Now this isn't something important to sort of keep track of, because you'll notice that this object has a center location, but it doesn't actually have like anything in it to display, to do. So empty objects like this, you can think of them as folders in your PC. They sort of exist, but really all they can do is hold things. Those things could be lots of things, could be anything, but that's kind of what they are. But you do want to get them located. So these are going to be folders with a position. So we're going to move this up, and we're going to put it where we would likely want a halo at. So this will be sort of the center of the whole halo thing. And so we'll position it up here, right above the head, right at the center. And so now we have our halo folder positioned over the head. And so now we go in here and we can create empty on it, which will then just create a child object. Again, just like we did with the head, now we've created one under it. And let's just call this halo ring generator. We'll maybe change it up, change how we're strategizing and making this happen over time, because there's a lot of different ways that we can maybe make this happen, but that's what we'll name it now, for now. And so now this, just as I mentioned before, has defaulted to the position of its parent object. You can see it's in the exact same spot. The head's, down there. But we moved the Halo system up, and now its child is there. So let's get started on an actual particle system. So we want to make this a particle system. So we don't want it to be a folder. So how do we make it not a folder? So what we do is we go over here to this inspector for the sort of details of any object, and we will go to add component. We're going to add a component, and you can see I've already searched for particle because it defaults to the last thing I typed, and I'm constantly adding particle systems. So there's a bunch of particle stuff. We don't need to worry about too much of those. What we're interested in here is this particle system, aptly named. So we'll select that, and now we have this whole component added in to the thing. And you can see over here, it's starting to do something because it takes on default settings. Let me just get this toned down. So it's not freaking out. Let me give it a material that doesn't look like nonsense. Just grab a little glow guy. All right. Okay, now we have a particle system that's not pure chaos. So that's where we've got for a default particle system. You slap in a particle system, this is kind of what it gives you, but a little bit more forceful. So you can see here in this list here, it is a long list of what's called subcomponents. So all of this belongs to particle system. And there are a lot of them, right? There's a ton. We're going to work our way through these sort of slowly. But we'll start with the 3 that are on by default, along with the core. So at the top, this first list here is the core elements of a particle system. And I realize that text is very small, and I'm not sure necessarily how to make it any freaking bigger. Let me see here. Oh no, that's not the right button. Come back here. Let me unlock you. And let me zoom in for the purposes of education. For now. And we'll zoom back out later. All right. How's that? Is that legible, like even remotely? Can we see what's going on in this list of tiny text? Okay, so this here is the core base traits of the particle system. So we'll start sort of from the top, because all of these are important, right? You can find all this information sort of through Unity's help docs, but of course it's relatively dry and sometimes hard to understand exactly what it's talking about. So the core things kind of overall dictate the initial state of the particles and the overall function of the particle system. So like duration here is how long the system as a whole operates in seconds. So this is 5 seconds that it will last. Looping, checked by default. Looping means after those 5 seconds are up, does it start over again? So right now we have a passive emission of this little guy that floats off. 5 seconds, then it just starts over again for another 5 seconds. It's a constant for everything. We have pre-warm, which is off by default. And for most things, I also leave off. So pre-warm, the intended purpose of pre-warm is that when this particle system activates, it will have pre-calculated the location of one extra run. So it will say what would have happened in the last 5 seconds, because this is a duration of 5 seconds. What would have happened in the last 5 seconds? And I'm going to put that into the space already. So it's sort of like at second 1, it's as though the thing had been running for 6 seconds. And so that can kind of help fill out things if they're supposed to already be occupying space. But I have seen some of the stuff just work weird with pre-warm. So I kind of try to avoid it if I can. But it is there and it can work. I think some of my systems do pre-warm. So start delay, this is essentially how long into that duration before it emits its first particle. So if it's a 5-second duration, if we were to add a 1-second delay here, that means that it would start emitting after the first second, and then so the second through 5th second it would emit, but the first second it will not. So start lifetime. This is different from start duration. Start lifetime is the lifetime of each individual particle. The duration is the duration of the system. The lifetime is the lifetime of the particles. The start speed is, of course, how quickly it is moving in the indicated direction, which we'll get to in a second, when it starts, when it's generated. There are ways to manipulate that later, but, you know, at first, how fast is it going? So, like, 0 means it's stationary, you know, and then we go work from there up. One thing to know is that because we're working around the space of an individual model, all of our numbers are going to be quite small, because the numbers in this Unity stuff is intended for like a whole game space, a whole scene, right? Like that's where it's building its default. I'm not sure what these values mean, if it's like based on a meter or like what it's based on, but it's intended for larger spaces. So you'll notice your sizes, your speeds, all of those are going to be very small, because you're building it around a very small overall space as far as Unity is concerned. So you can check 3D start size if you want it to be different sizes on different sides. Then we have our start size, which is just how big is the damn thing to start with. You can see over here, I made them smaller. You make them, you know, even smaller. Hey, come on. Give me a particle. Come on, come on, come on. There's one. Look at it. He's little now. Start rotation. We have a circle, so that's not really going to matter. But that's, you know, is the object rotated? Is the particle rotated? Flip rotation is to cause some particles to spin in the opposite direction. I think that's newer in 2020 and was not in 2019, because I haven't really been using it, but there are some systems that I could have been. There are other ways to do that same problem solving. Start color is fairly obvious. It's what color it is to start with. Hey, look, now they're red. So gravity modifier is, you know, how affected are these particles by gravity? We can add gravity. I think there is some gravity by default, perhaps. You can see if I push that up, they start falling. Whoops. You can also make it negative, so they go up. Okay, now we're going to get into some of the confusing stuff. So simulation space. So a simulation space determines sort of overall how they're going to end up moving in relation to the things around them, specifically their parent. So this is currently a simulation space of local. Now, what that means is that it's emitted some particles, and you can see those particles. However, if I move the model as a whole, you can see they move with the model, because it is obeying the local space. Now, other examples of those for me, right? All of these that are particles contained within objects, part of the, all throughout, those are considered in the local space because they move with the model. Now, the alternative to that is you can make the simulation space world. Now, when it's set as the world, if we move this, they stay where they were. So the example of that is up here, my drifting guys, these over here as well. Those are world simulation space because they don't get attached to their parent. They get released and then they just drift through the world. Keeping track of what needs to be local and what needs to be world is, of course, very important to get the effect that you're looking for. So, next we have a simulation speed. This allows you to essentially slow down or speed up the sort of entire system as a whole. This can be helpful when you are maybe like scaling up or down, like you made it too big and you like it, but like now it's just going too fast, or you want it to cross space a little slower. You can reduce the overall simulation speed, and you don't have to change every single one of the settings elsewhere in order to, bring it back into what you were aiming for. Delta time, not sure. Scaling mode, I don't think this is really that important. Play on awake. Play on awake means that as soon as the object is active, the particle system will play. So that's useful, like with a toggle. Toggling is usually done by like activating or deactivating this system. No, wait, this guy. Turning it off, turning it on, turning it off, turning it on. That's a toggle, and then you want it to play on awake so that it just starts up. Then we have emitter velocity. Just leave it as rigid body. You don't need to touch that. Max particles. This can come into play usually because I need to turn it up. Because it defaults to 1,000, which for most things, probably plenty of particles. But the way that it sort of works once it runs out of particles, it doesn't kill old particles to make new ones. It just stops producing particles until there's a free particle in that list, which can cause really weird effects if you're looking for like a fluid look to particle emission, and then it just gets wonky and starts stopping and starting, and you're not sure what it's doing and stuff like that. So auto random seed means that every time the particle system activates, it will just do whatever. And this is usually what you want. However, turning it off allows you to dictate a seed, and because the seed is a random seed, it doesn't really matter. But what you would use this for is if you want two particle systems to do the same thing at the same time. Hey, Mats, how's it going? Welcome. So if you have two, like, particle systems on either side of something that you want to make sure match, using the matching seed will allow all of their randomizations to be in sync. So, like, if you're having it make random colors or, random emissions, random speeds, or anything random, by using the same seed on both system, they will do the same thing. They will look matching, and that's the big thing that's used for. Stop action culling mode and ring buffer, I have never adjusted, so you don't really need to worry about those too much. So that is the core particle system stuff. Now, the next important thing, that's not all. I forgot about the one note. So On most of these traits, you can see that there is a little drop down to the right. And those, for things like this, say the start speed, this allows you to change between something like a constant, or a curve, or some random stuff. As I was just saying, right, about the random seed and making them match, this is because you can be operating random. So, for instance, you know, one of the very common ones to add a little bit of variety to the way the system looks, you can do, say, a random start speed between two constants. So that makes... Let me get a view to the side. Let me adjust this up so we can see it more. So now, well, if my big dumb face wasn't in the way, you can see that we have some that are a little faster, some that are a little slower. It gives it a much more organic appearance. It's not so stagnant. We've got some movement, some dynamism, if you will. And so that's something that you can do to lots and lots of different traits. And that's always this drop down here. So you can kind of check, you know, what's going to give me the option I want. Colors, same way. You can pick a color. You can pick, you know, random between two colors, random color, things like a gradient. So these are good ways to, you know, get a lot more going on. I have some pre-built gradients that I've been using previously, and, you know, things like that, which you can see now. Now we have all kinds of different colors happening. So that's easy ways to get a lot of variety going. So those drop downs here, very important things to keep in mind. Okay, so next on the list of, you know, automatically activated subcomponents here is emission. Emission is what dictates how particles are produced. That's pretty much what it means. So the number one here you can see is rate over time. You can see I just increased that so that you could see it better. So this number is how many per second. Make it 1, it's 1 per second. We'll have 5 particles out at any given point in time because they decay in 5 seconds. So we end up with 5 particles. If we want more, we can say 5 per second, and then we end up with a total of 25 particles. Very simple, but, you know, that's how we do that. So that's sort of the basic, straightforward particle emission. We do have some other options, and as stated, we can change these to a curve, random between two constants, give it a little variety, using those as well. Something to keep in mind is that trying to do numbers smaller than 1 starts running you into some weird behavior. Specifically, the first one is not emitted until essentially like the end of the process, not the beginning. So it doesn't emit one at 0 and then wait 10 seconds in this case, because I said, you know, 0.1 per second. It waits 10 seconds first, and then it gives you a particle. So it's something to keep in mind that you're not going to get a particle immediately if you just make that number smaller. But there's a way to do that better, and we'll get to that in a second. So this other option is called a rate over distance. So this is the value used to do things like the trails on the bottom of the model, or the finger writing. Because the way that works is it will draw particles based on the distance the emitter has traveled. So if in this case we say, you know, 100, you'll notice that we're not immediately getting any particles because, well, it's not moving. But if we drag it, suddenly particles happen because it's moving. So it is particles over a distance, which can be very useful for a variety of effects. But that's what that is. Can be very, very key to make certain things happen. Rate over distance. Obviously, the ones that I do for like the writing and stuff, those look that way because it is a rate over distance with 0 speed, so that, yes, motion is the trigger to generate a particle. In the case of the writing, the speed of 0 means that it will simply stay where it was when it was generated, right? So like, we, and so now they're just staying. And so that's you know, how that can happen. Okay, so then the last way to generate particles is much more controlled, and quite valuable for a variety of purposes. And that's here in bursts. So bursts, we'll just add 1. Oh, you know what? Let me give it the speed again so that we can stop with the 3D start size. We don't need that. So we've added a burst, and you can see that it's got a handful of properties, a couple of which can be, you know, turned into something else. We got infinite count. And then this, we can do constant curves, the randoms, and things like this. So in this case, we give it a time. This first one is defaulted to 0. An interval, a probability, how many cycles, and counts. So this is when you're trying to either be very specific in a timing, or you're trying to emit lots simultaneously, less frequently, let's say. So if we put this to 1, we put this to 1, and we put this to infinite, we have now done exactly the same thing as this rate over time here, as setting that to 1, because this interval is how many seconds between each time this will burst. The cycles is how many times will it do it before stopping, in this case infinite. How many are emitted? 1. When does it start? 0. And probability is what's the likelihood that this one will go off? And then in this case, it's 1. So this we have made the exact same as 1 up here. So how can we use this differently? Okay, so let's say we want to set this to 0.2 seconds with a count of 1 with infinite, interval of 1, and probability of 1. So now, yes, 1 meaning it's guaranteed to go off. This is a 0 to 1 percentage probability, essentially. 0, never. 1, always. 0.1, 10%. 0.5, 50%, etc., etc. So now we have sort of reproduced the idea of 2 rate over time, except rate over time is always a consistent pace. It's, you know, it's at 0. If it were 2, it'd be 0, 0.51, 1.52. At each one of those intervals, it would fire off a particle. However, because we can more fine-tune it using this, now we have one going off at 0, at 0.2, at 1, 1.2, 3, 3.2. So we've added a rhythm, essentially. And it's like da-da, da-da, da-da. So that's kind of the way we can get a little more control over the way something is emitted. This is a very relevant and important discovery as far as like kind of mastering it and figuring out how to get an effect that you want. This can be combined with other ones, by the by. So like this could be 1. We don't need this first one, and like now we've done the same thing with a little less fiddling down here. The constant rate, an additional burst. So let's say, what else can we do here? So let's say at 2.5, and by the way, this time is in relation to the duration up here, the life of the system. So right now, we can't have a time greater than 5, I don't think. If it's greater than 5, it's not going to go off because the system has looped back around to 0 by the time that it would go off. So we're at 2.5, account a big burst of 30. We only have time for one of these anyway, and let's say a probability of 0.25. So now there's this big burst that doesn't happen every time. It's 1 in 4. So in this case, statistically speaking, it will happen every 10 seconds. But obviously that's disregarding the fact that some of those times it's just not going to do anything, and statistics and randomness, who knows? Could be forever. Hey, there it is. And so that's the way we can work with probability. All right. And if you want to get rid of them, you select the line and then you hit the minus, and the plus adds it on. Okay, so that's emission in a nutshell. Not really a nutshell. We covered a lot of emission there, but it's really, really important to get the effect that you're looking for. Next up, we have shape. That's a good question. So those yellow squares are not visible in the final result. Those are showing because I have the system selected. It highlights the things that are part of the system. So if I stop selecting that, you can see they are no longer, I'm kind of surprised that they are still highlighted in blue, actually. They're no longer yellow because they're not selected. I am a little surprised to see that they're still blue, but essentially that shows the bounds of the particle itself. Because the circle that you see is dependent on the texture that we have applied to the particle. And the square around it shows the total possible size based on the size that we gave it in the setting. So that's the bounding box of the actual size of the particle. Even though in the end result it will not be visible. That is a good question, though. I take that for granted that I know what's going on in the viewfinder over here. Okay, so next up we have in our list of important stuff here that is by default on is the shape. The shape is, now that you can see, now that I have it selected, you can see that there has been a new gizmo made visible in the view over here, the scene viewer. And that is this, well, cone. Because by default, our emission shape is a cone. Now, I'm not going to go through every possible shape, but they generally have some similar settings, and fiddling with them kind of makes it obvious. So for the cone, for instance, we have the angle, which you can see over here that they kind of, they don't all move straight forward because we have an angle. So if we make, say, 60, you can see that they can fan out, which you can't because my big dumb head's still in the way. They fan out more. They kind of have more lateral movement when they're emitted. But you can also make an angle of 0, which now just makes a circle shooting straight forward. So that's the angle. Radius, kind of self-explanatory. You make it smaller, it's a smaller circle. And so then there's also radius thickness here. And so if we say make this 0.5, now, rather than a circle, we're working with a ring. And it's a little hard to see with this particular view. But you can see here this inner part is no longer being emitted from because it's now just the outer 50% because we set the radius thickness to 0.5. And then we also have the arc, which this determines how much of the circle is going to be used. So now that we've set it to 180, it is now only the, looks like the top half that will potentially emit. This, you know, can go all the way down if you... Very obvious, if we make that 10, you can see that it's just this very small space here that it's using to emit from. So that gives you all of the control over where something is coming from. So now that we kind of covered a lot of this stuff... Oh, hold on. This one's important. There's also random... No, sorry. Mode. There's mode of how it emits. And so this is random, self-explanatory. It, you know, comes out at random. Here, let me give us some more particles over time so that we can see this better. So we've got randomly emitting. Very obvious. Look at how random it is. The other one, say, is loop. And now it's kind of hard to understand initially. But what it is doing is it's like looping an emitter around, and then at each time, it's firing it from that position. Now, the challenge with using these other modes that I've more recently been trying to tackle is that you kind of have to get the speed of the loop properly set up with the emission rate, right? So by default, it's only making it happen like at 5 very specific points because the speed, you know, is either, well, I guess the speed's fast enough that it's probably making a bunch of cycles by the time another one is emitting. However, we can adjust the loop speed here. And so let's say 0.9, 0.1. Now we can far more easily see how this is working. You can see that there is a emitter that's looping around the space, and it's then emitting from that position specifically, not randomly anymore. It's going around. And so this can give you certain effects that you might aim to do like this, rather than, you know, being just random. Lots of my stuff's random because I just sort of want it to go. But this can give you a little more control while bringing a little more interest. Then there's some other options. There's like ping pong, which kind of like loop, except it's going to go to one side and then turn around, go and then turn around. It feels like a screensaver, honestly. The particles set to like loop and ping pong. It feels very screensavery to me. And then the burst spread, I'm honestly not totally clear on what the burst spread does. Spread 1, 2, 3, 5. Nope, spread goes between 0 and 1. I don't know. This might matter more if I were emitting it as a burst rather than a direct emission. Just, you know what? Experiment with it. Figure it out. I don't know. I'm just making shit up. So then within this, we have a variety of options. This is just cone. We can make it a sphere, which, come back. You can see now is emitting outward in a sphere pattern, just from a sphere, outward. There is a hemisphere that it's, you know, just on half. There's a lot of others. I can't go through every one all the time. We'll be here for freaking ever. But looking through there, you can see, you can find yourself all kinds of shapes to make it happen. If you remove shape, it all emits from a single point. So there, you do not always need a shape. I'm not really sure if you can get away with no emitter. I think you need that to get it. But you don't always need a shape, because if you're just working with a single point, you don't need the shape. But if you're trying to be a little broader, you need the shape. So then the last and final automatic one is down here, the renderer. The renderer dictates what the particle actually looks like. So there's a few render modes here. A billboard is essentially just the flat sort of texture style PNG standard issue particle. It's extremely common. You'll then have, I'm not sure what the normal direction is. I think that dictates the way it interacts with light. I don't ever change it, so I don't know enough. The material, that is what dictates what it looks like, or what texture gets applied to the shape. So like here, by shape I mean the render mode shape. So you can see I can change it to like stars. I got all kinds of different guys. I can make them little rings. All of these different options. So let's get this out of the way. Sort mode, I don't ever mess with. I'm not sure what that would do. Honestly, I don't adjust too terribly much in the render submodule. So the render alignment is one that is quite relevant. So this dictates sort of what orientation they stay in relation to you looking at it. So view means that with these particles as billboards, you will always see them the full flat side, right? These are just a flat image, but because it's set to the view render alignment, you always see the whole particle, right? Whole particle. However, if we change this to, say, world, now you can see they're flat. So sometimes this can be useful, but obviously when they're just a billboard like this, this is pretty weird. Here, let me move this over here so you can actually see what I'm talking about. This is not really what you want to be looking at. This is a little bit wonky, but we've made them flat, and so that's just, us screwing it up. There's also local facing, which is similar to world, except in this case, it is part of the head, right? So that if we rotate the head, you'll see these are now aligned with the head rotation, not world orientation. So the world would always stay vertical regardless of what the head was doing, because this is a local orientation. It has rotated with the head. And then there's also, I'm not sure what facing is. Velocity faces the direction it's moving. You can see it's kind of, actually, this actually does give me a really kind of a decent idea. So because of the way this velocity facing works, this would actually be very good for, and very interesting in making, even for my model, anybody in the digital space, right? Making little like floating transparent digital screens with minimal effort. Essentially, you can make, if you move them away at very slow speeds, it will, look like it's always facing the face, right? Because we've got it set to the head, it's sort of floating away. That's a little trick we can use. I might come back to that later to actually make that happen, because that sort of in this use case, it's quite interesting. Not always what you want, though. Not always the angle that you need these to be in. So commonly you're going to use view. For a lot of these, you want it to be view because you always want the person to see the whole thing. Because a lot of particles are intended to look like they're spheres, or they appear to be three-dimensional objects, but aren't really three-dimensional objects. And to maintain that illusion, you kind of need it to always be facing the camera. But it's important to know what that this option means, because there are plenty of circumstances where you're really going to want to fiddle with that to get an effect that you might be aiming for. So then we got some other flips, allow, roll, pivot, mostly stuff that I don't worry about. Masking, there's casting and receiving shadows. I usually have that stuff off, but I specifically use light a lot less with my model because, well, I exist in a digital space, so it's all sort of flat coloring. The risk of casting shadows and receiving shadows is that it can very quickly complicate your performance of your model, because Unity is going to have to calculate light a lot more to determine where shadows should be cast. So you can really impact your performance if you're trying to do shadow stuff with particles. So you need to be careful with that. Motion vectors, I don't fiddle with them. All this other stuff I generally leave alone. Something worthwhile mentioning is within here we've got like stretched billboard, which can give you like streaks, the appearance of like streaks rather than spots. So then mesh, this is a useful one as well. It's randomly selected cube mesh for us, which not too bad. We can work with that. So in this case, we select a mesh, which is like a shape, right? A cube, a three-dimensional object, and then we get a material to apply to that object. So now you can see that all of these are cubes with stuff on each side. So that's another one that can be very, very useful for certain effects. Okay. So let's get this back to billboard. So that is the run through of the basics, right? That is the core functionality of a particle system when you've made it fresh. Yes, the cube size, the mesh size is dictated by the particle size. So say for the instance that we've made it the cube again, if we come up here and we adjust the start size, now we have smaller cubes. Tiny cubes. Huge ass cubes. Monstrous cubes. So yeah, at that point the mesh is the particle, and so it's going to obey all of the sort of rules of the particle. Okay, so yeah, that's the run through of the basic set of particle subcomponents when you make a new one. Those are on by default. There's a lot more, but I think we'll sort of tackle those as we get to it, because hopefully you might have started getting some ideas how we can accomplish the goal that we set out to, which is right now we want to make a halo. So how do we make a halo? Okay, so first and foremost, changing the start color just to yellow, because halos are kind of yellow. And so the first thing we need to worry about is the shape. So I think what we want is a circle shape, but we want a speed of 0. We want our shape thickness to be very thin. Size, I think I'll adjust the overall size here of the so when adjusting size, this is kind of a worthwhile note. When adjusting overall size, you can see that I adjusted this here. So this essentially owns the entire object. This is the transform, which holds the position, rotation, and scale of the whole thing. And you'll notice that I reduced this from 1 to 0.1, which also reduced everything in here. So, yes, sort of. It's sort of the system size, but it's not technically tied to the particle system, aside from the fact that they're both on the same object. Because I could have done that exact same thing by adjusting this radius here, and then adjusting the sizes, because these are in relation to this, which I do believe is possibly what this scaling mode means. Yes. So I think I can stop having the particles controlled by this size, but anyway, so that's something to keep in mind. There are kind of a lot of ways to sort of like move and shift things, both within the system and then outside the system, but as part of the object itself. And so similarly, I'm going to do the same thing in that I am going to rotate the entire object there so that it is more halo shaped. I'm going to change our glow back to the one that's kind of a more circle-y shape. Is that how do we feel about that size? I want to make that a little smaller. I'm gonna make the fine tuning here in the radius because I don't want to keep making this smaller from the 0.1. I'm also gonna switch the simulation space to world, or to local. I noticed that when I rotated it, the particles stayed vertical. I want that to be local so that it moves with the head, which we can show. So now, if I move, right, it moves with the head, and that's what we want. So then we're on the right track. One way that we can do this is that we can then stop this being random. We can make it a loop. We can emit more. Now we're getting somewhere. So we can see that we're on the right track, but we need more particles, right? And so to keep in mind, what is dictating our maximum number of particles is sort of the cross-section of our rate over time, our duration, and our lifetime. Mostly our lifetime, honestly. So we look like we're covering about half. So if we up that to 10, well, would you look at that now that they last 10 seconds? That's exactly enough to get it all the way around. I did say that I was going to make that a little smaller, though. Let's 0.8, 0.7, 0.6. Yeah, that's a nice halo size, I think. And so, at a very simple level, we have a halo, actually. and by all accounts, what we have here is a halo. And so I guess really, that's kind of the first thing to point out is that once I got over talking about all of the systems, this is pretty easy, right? Like, the challenge with particle systems is learning the particle system in general, because once you've got that, it's a hell of a lot easier to work with, and you can do a lot of things pretty freaking quick. So, I'm not gonna be done here, because I want to show that there's a lot of other things that you can do with this. And there's alternate ways that we could have accomplished this as well. We have simply made a halo out of the trails. And that's it. Like, it's just 2 particles that get generated every 20 seconds, and it's a halo. Like, that's it. With enough time, I'm pretty sure we could find an ideal sort of circumstance for this. But we don't really need to do that necessarily. I'm not trying to make the perfect halo. I'm just trying to give some insight into what can be done. So what we have here is a halo. Okay, so there is still a very important note that I need to touch on that I have left far too long because I kind of forgot about it because I got distracted doing other things. And again, that is, I need to talk about the material that we're using. Because the material is an important part of making the particle system look like anything, essentially. So really what we need to talk about in general is what a material is. So what is a material? So with every, well, VRM or anything you're pulling into Unity, you're going to have materials. And so what materials are sets of shaders and all of the supporting information that make that shader function. Usually several textures, or at the very least one texture with other things, and various other settings and stuff. So for instance, when you pull in a VRM from VRoid, what you end up with is all of these materials here. So the material is not particularly useful over here as the what it's showing us in the demo, the preview. But over here in the inspector, since we have a material selected, we can now see the shader that it's using, which for VRMs, it's VRM Imtune. You can use other ones like Poyomi, which I would highly suggest. But that's the shader it's using by default. And then all the information that goes along with it. We have like rendering types, textures, colors, lightings, matte caps, all kinds of stuff. And that's what a material is, broadly. However, I'm not really here to teach a whole lot about those materials. What we need to talk about are particle materials, because they are a little different usually. And for the purpose of most of what's going to need to be used for model particles, the main one you want to be familiar with is VSeeFace particles. If you click the shaders button, you can change it, and you can type standard, and you'll see here standard unlit VSeeFace particles standard, and you can select that, and you have a few settings within this. This is the main particle shader you'll want to use. There are other shaders that can work if you find them on, say, the Unity store or, you know, Booth, or somebody's just advertising particle shaders. Some will work. Some will definitely not. So you have to be sort of cognizant of that fact. The reason that VSeeFace Particle Standard Unlit is very useful is because it's designed to work with that transparent background that I brought up at the beginning. It will stay visible and sort of the correct color on the that transparent background. So that's a big part of it. Within it, you have your material options. First of all, let's start from the bottom, sort of here at the maps. This is the sort of simpler to understand potentially area. So we've got our texture itself, which is here, right? You can select your texture, you know, slap it in there. You can also, you know, search through here. One important note for this VSeeFace particle textures, the textures that you are using, let's select Big Glow 14, the alpha source here needs to be from grayscale. The other options here are like from input texture alpha, which would mean like if this is not black and white like this, but is actually like a PNG with transparency, you can use that in Unity, but it will not show up correctly once you're rendering this model. I struggled with that for quite a while, trying to figure out why some of my stuff simply wasn't visible properly. You need to use the from grayscale, and you need to then make the transparency appear as a grayscale. A lot of textures are like that anyway, but keep that in mind. It's very important. But that's kind of the only concern we have from the texture perspective. Once we get to that back in the material, we can then, we can tile or offset if we want the texture, if we're trying to do something with the texture. Typically, we want these materials to be white, because one of the other things that using a specific particle shader for, rather than something like the Poyomi or the Mtoon shader, why don't we just use those here? By being a particle shader, when it goes into a particle system, all of the like color over lifetime, initial color, those things will affect this material. Sometimes they won't. Like if you just throw an Mtoon material on top of a particle system, those initial settings won't take effect. It will simply be the color that it claims to be in the material. Sometimes that's fine. Also, you don't always need it to be taking on those effects, like color over lifetime. Like one of the things that I did with a particle system was I got a shader specifically for the the Earth. Like it shows and looks like the Earth's surface, right? And I made a particle out of using that material just on a sphere particle. I didn't give it any other, initial colors because it didn't matter, but it just took the actual color texturing from the material. And sometimes that's fine. But if you're trying to use the particle system to manipulate the color, like its transparency and stuff, you need a particle shader for the material. Also, you can use the intensity here to make it more color than like full color, which means that it will be affected by emission. There is an emission option here. The problem with this emission option is that the color you give it will actually be that color. So if you color this white, that emission won't take on the particle color properly. It will just be more white than it was normally, which sometimes could work. In this case, emitting a little more white actually might be able to make this halo appear like it's white hot on the middle rather than yellow, like full yellow. You could play with that a little bit to get interesting effects out, but I'm not going to worry about that too much. I usually don't use this emission. I just turn the albedo intensity up over 100%, so to speak. And that means that it will behave with emission properly, because I use bloom, so we gotta be cognizant of that. So then above this, we have like a rendering mode. This is sort of the various ways that it can render. Additive for rendering mode and multiply for color mode is generally how particles behave. Like that's the most common. That's what most of mine do. Because that means that like you can see behind it, but it's kind of taking on the colors behind it. It's like multiplying the colors so that it has a transparent sort of appearance, and it's sort of the most natural looking for glowing, moving specks, kind of like what a lot of mine are. But you can make it opaque. You can make it a cutout so that it's just, either visible or not. So, transparency is just invisible, and then cut out. Everything else is fully visible. You can have a fade, which kind of does weird stuff. Transparent, which generally works a lot of times. The subtraction is weird. The modulate is weird. I haven't found particularly strong uses for those, but, by all means, try.
And then down here we have main options. Flipbook frame blend is, I think, if you're using a flipbook animation material or texture, which is like cycles through things to give it an animated appearance. I think this might help smooth it out. I rarely am using that, so I don't worry about it. Two-sided means that you'll see both the front and the back. This is very important for things like the rings in my torso, because if it's not two-sided, you won't see the back. It'll just be the front. Soft particles has caused me a lot of headaches before. So soft particles, like, disappear when they're close to other stuff, and close is relative and usually too highly tuned, so to speak, so that particles just sort of start disappearing when you don't expect them to. So I've not been using soft particles. I don't use camera fading, and distortion has been really hard to get to work properly as well. So this is usually what all of my particles look like. I want them two-sided, and that's kind of it. You'll also notice, I should have talked about it when I came in to look at this, this apply to systems. If one of these materials gets put into a particle system, one of these materials with the shader, it's got a few specific, like, unique traits that you'll need to come in here and hit apply to systems so that they appear properly. Sometimes that breaks things. Very rarely. The rings, for instance, I can't turn that on, or they end up at super strange orientations. But generally, you kind of want to apply those so that weird stuff doesn't happen. So, but that's materials. That's the very fundamental of materials, and the material you're going to want to probably work with for your particle systems is this VSeeFace Particle Standard Unlit. That's the main one you're going to want, and why. Okay, so that's kind of all of the stuff in Unity that we wanted, right? Like, we've covered, I think, a tremendous amount about particle systems, and I have still only sort of scratched the surface. We have our passable but imperfect halo. It's pretty good. It's interesting. It's a little dynamic. You can see lots of the things that we could potentially do with it, refine, tweak, improve, but we've got it. So let's finally talk about how do we get this into Vnyan, in our case, because we've been using 2020 Unity. We cannot put this into VSeeFace, but we can put it into Vnyan. It's very simple. We select the top here, demo. Well, we fill our little model information up. Then we come up here to VSF SDK. We export avatar bundle. We'll put that on our desktop. And you can see that this is going to be a .vsf avatar. You could see, if I put this in the right place, particle tutorial model, .vsf avatar. So it's no longer going to be a VRM. Now, I should point out, and I should have pointed out before, but I'm going to do it now while it's, exporting. So now that it's going to be a VSF avatar, it's important to note that it's not going to work anywhere that requires a VRM. It's a different file format. It's very specific. Also of note is you cannot re-import a VSF avatar into Unity and then start editing it. It's a standalone sort of Unity object component that can't be sort of rehydrated in Unity to edit. So you have to keep your Unity project intact where you are making all of these edits, because you will have to export a new one from this same, project every time you've made edits and improvements. You can't send it to somebody, have them open it up in their Unity, make edits. The model, that is. You could send your project, but you cannot just send the VSF avatar. It's very important to be aware of that. Because that is some limitations. You really need to be cognizant of that, or you can find yourself into a really tough spot if you were like, oh, well, now that I've got the file, I can just get rid of this project and you know, I'll just pull it in if I want to make any edits. That it's simply not the way the VSF avatars work. Very, very important. However, we do have our VSF avatar out now. So let us grab our Vnyan. We can simply load avatar. Ta-da! And you can see we have our active particle system. You know what? It looks pretty good. Not too bad for just, you know, bashing it together. You'll notice the mouth doesn't move because I'm using a different set of blend shapes, so, you know, it also doesn't blink. Sorry for the lifeless stare. We'll hide that. All we care about is the particle system, which works. We did the thing we set out to do. And, you know, aside from making the particle system was easy. And that's why we have spent hours talking about actually constructing the particle system and mere minutes on getting the model actually, you know, constructed, so to speak, like the baseline fundamentals. Let's go back to me, shall we? All right, now get out of here. So to reiterate, let's kind of go back, wrap up all the stuff that we covered, right? So fundamentally, what do you have to do to get a VRoid model to have particle systems? Well, you export it from VRoid as a VRM. You have to set up that development environment with your Unity, UniVRM, and VSF SDK. Those are the three components you need. Once you've got those, you import your VRM into Unity using the UniVRM. You then add the particle system, which is the vast bulk of the effort. You have to make a particle system that's doing the thing you want, right? And then you export it using the VSF SDK as a VSF avatar, and then you can open that up in either VSeeFace, if you've sort of prepped for that, or Vnyan, which would be my suggestion, if you've, you know, prepped for that. So that's the thing. That's what it takes at a sort of very high level to get a particle system onto a model. The devil's in the details, as we have seen, because it takes far longer to make the particle system do the thing you want than to do all the rest of the stuff. That's what it comes down to. If you find it useful, you know, toss me a like, hit the subscribe, I guess. If you're not subscribed, I can't imagine anybody not subscribed has made it to this point, but you know what? I'll do the due diligence. Hit the like, hit the subscribe, hit the stupid notification bell that shouldn't exist, but I hate it. Thank you very much for coming. Bye.